Welcome to the History of Humble video series, sponsored by the Humble Museum. I am your host, Dr. Robert Moe. In this episode, we will look at the early history of the Humble area. Let's start with the Atascocita Road. It was established by the Spanish in 1756. It started in El Paso, then went through San Antonio, Houston, Liberty, and Beaumont before terminating in Opelousas, Louisiana. The Spanish used the road to travel across Texas, with outposts along the way to keep the French, who were in Louisiana, from trading with the Indians. The Spanish named the road for the military outpost and settlement of Atascocita, near present-day Liberty. The present-day Atascocita Road follows the path of this original road. In 1821, the colonial Spanish government gave Moses Austin an initial grant to settle 300 families in the province of Texas. By 1825, under his son Stephen F. Austin's leadership, and within a newly independent Republic of Mexico, the colony spanned 19 present-day Texas counties. The two earliest land grants, near the area that would eventually become Humble, which was at the eastern edge of the original colony, belonged to David Harris and Victor Blanco. In 1824, David Harris, an original member of Austin's colony, was granted a league of land along the San Jacinto River near present-day Lake Houston. This was about 4,400 acres. By the way, Harris County is named after David's brother, John Richardson Harris. In 1831, Stephen F. Austin allocated to his personal friend, Victor Blanco, a 5-league tract of land along present-day Lake Houston, just south of the David Harris survey. This was over 22,000 acres of land. In fact, it's the largest land grant in all of Harris County. Victor Blanco was a Mexican politician who served as governor of Texas from 1826 to 1827. A gentleman who was important to Humble's history is Joseph Dunman. Dunman and his family migrated from Louisiana to Texas in 1825. Joseph Dunman served as an Alamo rider. He carried Colonel Travis's plea for Alamo reinforcements to the small town of Liberty. After Texas won its independence from Mexico, Dunman was one of the earliest settlers in the Humble area. An early name for this area was the Dunman Settlement. At one point, he and his descendants owned most of the land in the present-day Humble area. The next important person in our story is Pleasant Smith Humble. He was a Civil War veteran from Louisiana. He moved to Harris County about 1866. In 1870, he moved to the present-day Humble area, where he ran a small grocery store and operated a ferry over the San Jacinto River. He was a very savvy politician and a lawyer. In 1876, he was elected as the Harris County Commissioner for Precinct 4. That was a very powerful position, and still is today. That position gave him a say in how Harris County spent its money on roads, schools, drainage ditches, and so on. He was also elected as a Harris County judge from 1887 to 1905. In 1875, work began on a railway that would cut through the forest of East Texas. It was called the Houston East and West Texas Railway, and was started by investor and railroad entrepreneur Paul Bremen. As he was building the railroad, Bremen sold excursions that allowed Houstonians to travel out to San Jacinto Springs, which was located on the San Jacinto River just north of Humble. At San Jacinto Springs, passengers could enjoy fishing, swimming, boating, picnicking, and dancing. These excursions to San Jacinto Springs introduced Houstonians to the natural beauty of the Humble area. The train opened up the forest of East Texas to commerce and development. Sawmills purchased land along the railroad tracks, and communities developed around these sawmills. One such community was the Lord's Mill community. It was centered around the Lord and Noble Sawmill, owned by Irvin Capers Lord, a former mayor of Houston, and Curtis Noble, the sheriff of Harris County. By 1883, this successful community of 150 people had a U.S. post office, as well as cattle breeders, livestock businesses, and 4 sawmills. In 1885, to settle a debt, Irvin Lord lost his sawmill in bankruptcy court. After that, the Lord's Mill community fell apart. After the Lord's Mill Community Post Office closed in 1886, Pleasant Umble assumed responsibility for the local mill. In August of 1886, he worked with the Postmaster of Houston to apply for a new U.S. post office for his community. For the location of the new post office, he used his own name, entering Humble, Texas on the application. It is because of this choice that Humble has its unique pronunciation. Pleasant Humble pronounced his name with a silent H, and the town followed suit. German native Charles Bender immigrated to America in 1815. After serving in the Confederate Army during the Civil War, Bender purchased a sawmill in Spring, Texas. As the sawmill business grew profitable, Bender and his partner purchased the bankrupt Millage and Calhoun sawmill in Humble, located on the west side of the railroad tracks. Bender and Company's purchase included 17 mules, 2 horses, 73 head of oxen, a train engine, log tram cars, wagons, mill machinery, and 3,600 acres of timberland. Thanks to the Charles Bender sawmill, Humble survived as a lumber town during the 1890s. To improve productivity, Bender built a narrow-gauge train through the wooded area around Humble to haul logs to the mill. During the oil boom, he charged oilfield workers for rides between the Humble train station and the oil fields out at Moonshine Hill. The company issued tokens for use at the commissary, and over the years allowed employees to buy the houses the company let them live in. The name still lives on in Aldine Bender Road, Bender Avenue, and the Charles Bender Performing Arts Center. The Texas oil boom started at the Spindletop Salt Dome in Beaumont in 1901. After that, prospectors went looking for other salt domes along the Texas coast. They found one east of Humble in an area known as the Eccles Ridge. Drilling for oil began in Humble in 1902. Unfortunately, gas explosions destroyed many of these early rigs. The Moonshine Oil Company was the first to strike oil on November 7, 1904. After that, businessmen, oilfield workers, and others descended upon the small town to seek their fortunes in the oil fields, as the field proved to be one of the most prosperous in the United States. It was during this time that Charles Bender laid out the streets for a town. He mapped out 23 blocks of land and named the 4 streets running east to west after famous oil men that were drilling for oil in Humble at the time: Henry Stadeye, Prentice Granberry, Patillo Higgins, and Charles Barrett. Barrett Street was later renamed to Main Street. The initial oil boom subsided quickly, but the Humble oil field had 2 subsequent booms over the next few years as roughnecks developed deeper drilling techniques. The 2-mile-long salt dome at Eccles Ridge became the center of the Humble oil field, which yielded an astounding 15 million barrels of oil in its first year of production. By 1907, the area was called Moonshine Hill, in honor of the company that made the first oil strike, the Moonshine Oil Company. Ross Sterling was a successful businessman. He owned feed stores in the 4 main oil boom towns of the time, including one in Humble. In 1907, he bought 4 locally owned banks in each of these oil boom towns and reopened them as state banks, including the Humble State Bank. In 1911, Ross Sterling and other oil well owners formed the Humble Oil Company. They had $150,000 in assets, but Sterling had controlling interest. At the beginning, they held their meetings in the Humble State Bank building. As that business took off, Sterling sold his feed stores and his banks to focus on the oil company. The company reorganized in 1916 as the Humble Oil and Refining Company. They expanded their operations into refineries and pipelines. Due to the high demand for oil products during World War I, Humble Oil's fortunes took off in 1917. Around that time, they moved their offices to Houston and were no longer affiliated with the town of Humble. They went into a deal with Standard Oil of New Jersey. They took $17 million in exchange for 50% of their shares. The company operated gas stations, under the names of Enco, Esso, and Humble for decades. In 1972, the company changed its name to Exxon. But Ross Sterling got out of the business in 1925 and eventually went on to become governor of Texas. The earliest school in the Humble area was established in 1873. It was called Joe Dunman Schoolhouse and was a school for well-to-do families that could afford to pay for their students' education. In 1884, a new law changed education across the state. All of Harris County was geographically divided into common school districts, similar to the district boundaries we have today. The Humble area was set up as Harris County Common School District number 28. In 1888, the Commissioners Court split District 28 into two parts. The northern portion remained as District 28, while the southern portion became District 35. Each of these two school districts coexisted for many years with their own schools and their own staff. However, by 1917, District number 35 wasn't doing so well. So in 1918, the two districts were combined into a new district, District 50. A few months later, in February 1919, the Texas State Legislature transformed District 50 into the Humble Independent School District. Humble was incorporated 2 times. The first incorporation occurred in 1910, with Louis James Sloan serving as the first mayor of Humble, and Nick Lambert serving as the second. By the end of 1911, the citizens voted to abolish the incorporation, and Humble went back to being just a town. In 1933, Humble was incorporated again and elected Dr. John Brown DuBose as mayor. Many events occurred after 1950 that encouraged more people to move to the Humble area. In 1953, the city of Houston created Lake Houston, a reservoir on the San Jacinto River, east of Humble. It became the main water supply for Houston and a recreational spot for the local community. In 1956, the city of Houston annexed 108 acres to increase the size of the city. A good portion of that land included Lake Houston and areas around Humble. Humble, which used to be out in the sticks, was now a suburb of Houston. In the late 1950s, work was being completed on U.S. Highway 59 through the west side of Humble. Humble was now just a 20-minute drive from Houston. In 1965, construction began on Houston Intercontinental Airport on the southwest side of Humble. The opening of the airport brought many more businesses and people to this community. In 1969, work began on the construction of the Kingwood neighborhood, a joint project between the King Ranch and the Friendswood Development Company. The Kingwood development spurred much of the growth in the Humble area during the 1970s, as did the opening of the Northeast Medical Center in 1977. In 1984, Deerbrook Mall opened in Humble and brought with it a large number of retailers. That same year saw the opening of the Kingwood campus, known as the Little College in the Woods, which later became part of the Lone Star College system, one of the largest community colleges in the nation. Today, the Humble area includes the city of Humble, Kingwood, Atascocita, Summerwood, and many other neighborhoods within the Lake Houston area.